Hello everyone, this is your introductory lecture for Typography 1, and basically I'm just going to talk a little bit about why type is so important, why it matters so much to us. I want to talk to you about a revolutionary communications technology. This is a world-changing technology. It allows people to communicate across vast distances. It allows people to communicate across languages. It allows people to communicate across time itself. This technology is simple enough for a child to learn, and it doesn't require any network or power of any kind. By now you've probably guessed I'm not talking about the internet. I'm actually talking about written language. We don't tend to think of writing as a technology, but it is in fact a technology that has changed the world drastically. It allows us to do all the things I just mentioned. Written language allows transmission of thought across vast distances, across languages, across time. I can read a book that was written by Benjamin Franklin. I can learn the innermost thoughts of someone who died 200 years ago or more because of written language. We can keep reliable records. We don't have to rely on our poor memories. We can write it down. It is a pretty amazing technology. Type is the mass production of written language. Written language is several thousand years old. Type is only about 600 years old. And it is very much, if you imagine a craftsman making chairs by hand with all hand tools, well, you can imagine probably a pretty beautiful wooden chair, but you can also imagine that it might take a long time to make that chair. If that same craftsman has automated lathes and an assembly line, well, those chairs can be made more quickly, they can be more consistent, and they can be far less expensive. That's what type did for the written language. It made it much less expensive, much more available. Writing was the domain of a very few people until type came along, and then written language became the domain of pretty much everyone in the world. So written and printed language has enabled other technologies. So many human technologies simply would not be possible without written language. Written language, the very earliest traces of it that they've found were uncovered around the building of the pyramids. And they weren't, we're not talking about the hieroglyphics inside the pyramids, but we're talking about written work orders and supply lists and supplies for the slaves who built the pyramids. I'd just like to throw this in here. This is an alternate view of the Great Pyramids that you don't often see, that there's a teeming modern city right behind it. They always show this view that shows it with a desert background. I find this interesting, just a slightly different perspective. George Washington Bridge, or any bridge, would not be possible without written language. You tried describing a structure of this size with these exacting engineering specifications verbally and remembering it all without being able to write anything down, it's not possible. We certainly couldn't have gone to the moon or built an international space station in Earth orbit. We certainly could not have sent robots to Mars and let them take selfies without written language. But coming back to Earth for a moment, this is, I think, a fantastic example of the power of the written language and the power of type. This would be a kind of an amazing scene to someone from 50 years ago, that we all carry around pocket computers. And they are able to wirelessly connect to this global information network. Now, I find it very interesting that one of the predominant uses of smartphones, or any mobile phones, is texting. People have wholeheartedly embraced type as the medium with which they want to communicate. If you have a smartphone in your pocket, you can make a voice call, you can make a video call, you can record a movie, and the way that most people use these tools to communicate is with type. I think someone from 200 years ago, 150, 200 years ago, might not be all that surprised, actually, by how much we love texting. They might be surprised by how small the machine is, and they might be asking, where are the wires for your handheld telegraphs? But they would not be very surprised that telegraph is a very useful means of communication. We have basically recreated the same technology digitally. So I want to talk to you about a specific book. Lucretius was a Greek philosopher. He wrote an epic poem. It was called On the Nature of Things. Sometime around the year 55 BCE. And this book offered a view of scientific thought that holds up today. It is a poem, it is a fanciful work, but it talked about exploration, developing hypotheses, testing hypotheses, gaining knowledge. He really described the scientific process before the scientific process existed. So in the 14th century, this would be the 1300s, On the Nature of Things was thought to be lost. People knew of the work, they knew of the epic poem because it was referenced in other books that they had read, but no copies existed as far as anyone knew. They thought it was just lost to the ages. At that time, books were hand copied. Monks would write out an entire book longhand. They were extremely expensive to produce, mainly because it took a really long time. Imagine transcribing an entire book by hand. And they were extremely precious because it would take so long to reproduce a book by hand. You could barely keep ahead of deterioration. You were barely ahead of just the replacement rate. Forget making lots and lots of copies. You could just stay on top of, by the time you finished your copy, the original you were copying from was very likely to be decaying and falling apart. So this happened mostly in monasteries, and the monastery libraries were carefully guarded and controlled. Even within the monastery, not all the monks could get at the books. This was not like the New York City Public Library, where you could go in, get a library card, and just look at pretty much any book you want. You had to be a monk, you had to be a scribe, you had to be allowed into the library in the first place, and these books were just precious, precious, precious guarded material. So this guy, Poggio Braccolini, he was a book hunter. He mounted expeditions to monasteries to find lost books. He would get funding, he would have an assistant, they would get on donkeys or horses and ride to these monasteries, which were far away from the cities. They're usually up in mountains somewhere. Um, it would be very difficult for him to get into the libraries. He would have to win the good graces of the monk who ran the library. And then once he was actually in the library, he would have to find these books. Well, he found On the Nature of Things in 1417. He and his assistant hand copied it, and they took it back to Venice, where he was from. And they published the book in the 1430s. In the early 1400s, movable type was invented and printing was invented. This was the mass production of written language. So when he found the copy of this lost book, he and his assistant copied it by hand, but then they brought their hand copy to a printer who was then able to typeset the book with metal type and produce hundreds of copies. Well, this book was a bestseller. It was a 13th century bestseller. And it became a very popular and highly influential book. And it influenced a lot of modernist thinking and it influenced a lot of scientific thinking. It influenced people like Galileo, Freud, Darwin, Einstein, Thomas Jefferson, just to name a few. If you saw the new Cosmos TV series with Neil deGrasse Tyson, he actually mentions this book in a very early episode. It is still considered a very important work. So I learned this whole story by reading another book called The Swerve. This book was given to me as a gift. You'll see why I point that out later. The Swerve, which is the book given to me as a gift, made me curious to read the original poem On the Nature of Things. And I was able to get on my phone, go on the iBook store, look it up, and oh, there are several different copies, and I just chose the free one. So I was able to download a free copy on my phone in the middle of the night. So I barely had to do any more than think about it, and it was in my possession. So compare the journey of this book and how much easier it was for me than it has been for other people to get at this book. So, 55 BCE books were handwritten, hand copied, they were valuable, they were rare, very few people could access them. Up until the 15th century, books were handwritten, hand copied, they were incredibly rare, and this book was nearly completely lost. They think there were only 1 to 3 copies actually existing in the world before Poggio found his copy. In the 1430s, books were mass-produced and distributed via the new technology of printing with movable type. They were shipped by land and sea. Books were expensive, but they were accessible to many people. Granted, at that time, you had to be wealthy or maybe upper middle class to even afford the luxury of a book. You had to be fairly educated in order to read, but it was still a whole heck of a lot more people than were able to read it just a few years before. In the 2010s, a popular book, The Swerve, is mass-produced, ordered online, shipped in 48 hours. The U.S. list price was $27. Amazon, offers deep discounts. So the person who bought it for me probably paid $22. I don't know. Rather inexpensive for a hardcover book. And then it led me to an ebook, which was instantly accessed and free. Um, so the whole story here, if you go through left to right, is a story of increased accessibility to information. People can get more information more easily than ever before in human history. And every step of the way here is a step of making it easier to access information. And it is all through, at first, written language, then through type. And on our last of the 5 steps, it is through the electronic transmission of text. So this is what type has done for us. And when I say us, I don't just mean us in this class, I mean us as human beings. Information is widely available, easy to access, and this is why I call it one of humanity's most important technologies. Now, up until the 1980s, actually using type was something that the average person didn't do that much of. It was really only used by designers and often by a specialized subset of designers, typographers. Desktop publishing, which is what we originally called digital design, it democratized typography in the 1980s. So fine typography is now in the hands of the masses. You know, my 70-year-old mother has favorite fonts. It's in almost everyone's hands. This is overall a very, very good thing, but it has led to a lot of very poorly executed typography in the modern world. Typographers used to be highly trained, and now it's basically anyone with a computer can be a typographer. So this means that you, as new designers, have a lot of very, very bad examples. So what this means is that you have to unlearn some things that you think you may know about typography in order to become a good typographer. So I've said it before already, but I'm going to say it again. Type is an absolutely crucial design tool. A good designer must be a good typographer. You already use type every single day, but in this course you will learn to use type well. You're going to learn the structure of letter forms. That's where we're going to start. You're going to learn how to classify different typefaces. You're going to learn about legibility, spacing, arrangement of type, and editing. You will get a taste of type design. You'll get to design a few of your own letters, and you're going to design a potential portfolio piece for your final project. So even though this is an intro class, our final assignment is going to be something that's worthy of your portfolio. So 15 classes from now, you're going to be a fledgling typographer, and you're going to be a much better designer because of that. And that's all.